everyone. This is my new theme music. Hope you like it. I'll explain all about it later when I've got a proper recording of it, because that really is probably going to come across as a bit pants. So I'm just going to kill that right there, and I'm going to get on with the presentation. Not least because this is the third or fourth time I've tried to do it. Events have been moving pretty quickly over the last few days. Today is Thursday the 13th of December. And we are talking about prime ministers versus presidents. We've had an awful lot of movement on this over the last few days. So much, in fact, that I think it's really important that we remain focused on the exam. You really need to make sure you keep it simple. Remember, we are looking at building an argument. And so we are looking at 6 points, 3 on one side, 3 on one hand, and 3 on the other. So 3 points here and 3 points here. And all the way through, don't forget, you need to be building an argument, and you also need to be building into that your AO3. Don't forget your intermediate conclusions. Keep your eyes on the prize. What we're trying to do here is to answer a question, build an argument, and answer a question, and make sure you have your evidence with you. And we're going to give you a lot of evidence in the course of this particular presentation. But do remember, what you're trying to do is to build an argument explaining where power lies in the executive, and does it live here or does it live there? So to answer this question, we need to look at the executive in two senses. We need to look first at the dynamics within the executive. What is the nature of cabinet government? To what extent do the rules of cabinet government hold? And that, of course, is all about the relationship between the Prime Minister and Cabinet. But then, on the other hand, we also need to look at how the Parliament interacts with government, how that particular relationship unfolds. And there we're looking at the way in which, or the extent certainly to which, the tail wags the dog. Because fundamentally, if the Prime Minister can dominate this line of things, then the Prime Minister can essentially dominate this line of things. And the whole thesis here is the way in which the Prime Minister can become incredibly powerful. But to argue that, we need to look at the structure of the office, we need to look at the powers we're talking about, we need to look at the vulnerabilities as well, and the way in which Prime Ministers can be held to account, and the sanctions that they may endure. And we also need to look at what Prime Ministers do on a sort of working basis. Style and apparatus, style and appearance and all of this. This is largely going to be covered in a different presentation that you've already got, which is called PM and Cabinet. And I'll make sure I link off to that video. I think it's strung across two. Make sure I link off to that video in the notes. So here we go. Looking at differences between prime ministers and presidents. First of all, we need to make it evident that in the UK, we run a parliamentary government. Government derives all of its authority from Parliament, and the rules of that particular game, you should know by now, are from, through, and to. Chosen from Parliament, operating through Parliament, and accountable to Parliament. Now, that could not be more different in the case of the United States. In the United States, we have discrete offices. We have clear water between the President and Congress. We have separate elections. They get there via a different method. And once they're there, we have a system of checks and balances where one watches what the other does, or as Madison said so eloquently, ambition set to counter ambition. That could not be more different from that, and obviously that could be a significant point of contrast in the course of making an essay in component 2, and certainly in component 3. When we move on to the Westminster system again, we move into cabinet government and the way in which cabinet functions collectively. This is all about what cabinet does, and cabinet, remember, has two roles. It has an executive function and it has an administrative function. And if you took the time to look at the Yes Prime Minister sketch, you saw that in action. First of all, they had to make the decision, do we relocate the troops from the south to the north? And then once we've made that decision, whose responsibility is it to go and do the job? Now, that obviously is a example from fiction, but you can see that all the way through in the real world. The government will come up with a cunning wheeze. And then, having come up with that cunning wheeze, it washes it through Parliament to legitimise it or to turn it into law, and then it comes back to Parliament, and Parliament has to do the job. And all of that is coordinated at a cabinet level. And so cabinet has both an executive and an administrative function. Now, remember that for later, because it's really important. And then within cabinet, we have the notion of primus inter pares. The prime minister sits there as primus inter pares. Now, what does that mean? Well, the problem is it doesn't really mean anything. In fact, it's an oxymoron. What it means in practice is that prime ministers do what prime ministers do, and cabinet either allows it or it doesn't allow it. Prime ministers will try to get away with whatever they can, and what they can get away with is really just a function of the extent to which the cabinet, is going to tolerate their actions. This raises a particularly interesting concept called elastic theory, which we go on to discuss a little bit later. And basically it does exactly what it says on the tin. The Prime Minister can stretch it so far, but at some point that is going to come back. So you can push it so far, but at some point that is going to snap back and catch them unawares. Moving across to the presidential system, there is a huge difference here in that the president has a direct mandate. The president has an authorization from the people to exercise power directly. Power is not shared collectively, it is not derived. The president won the election, he gets to manage. Now within that he does have a cabinet, but that has a very, very diminished role. The role of the cabinet here is strictly admin. The decisions are being made by the president. Admin. Ooh, what am I doing? Sorry. Admin. So the cabinet in the United States has an administrative role, but not an executive role. Again, very, very important that you can understand the distinction between having an executive function and having an administrative function. So that's good. Let's move on. And we'll move on to a theory called spatial management. Again, this is very, very important when we come to look at how things are organized in the executive. The question is where decisions are being made. And one model of these is called the core executive, and the other is cabinet government. Cabinet government, remember, is really how it's supposed to work, and so core executive is a bit of an anomaly, or at least an aberration. So in the core executive, we have decision-making centralized within the prime minister. Whereas over in cabinet government, we have that notion of collective decision-making. Again, we're looking at the executive function here. Is the executive the prime minister, or is it the collective? Executive, very, very important idea. And in the center, we're looking at executive as decision-making. How are those decisions made? Well, in the core executive, we have a system of informal, bilateral, and select meetings. In Blair's administration, that was organised around what we called sofa government. It was whoever was sitting on Blair's sofa at the time in the office of Number 10. Whereas, of course, over in the cabinet government model, we have formal cabinet meetings with formal minutes and all of that sort of stuff. Again, the contrast there could not be more marked. This is how Blair is running things, and this is how it is supposed to run. Also, we have that ad hoc lines of accountability and responsibility. It's not clear who decided what and not clear who was there when the decision was made. Whereas in a cabinet model, we have clear lines of accountability and responsibility. So as I said earlier, we've got models here, one of which was under Blair. He is very much your go-to example for the core executive, whereas May, I think, is a very good example of cabinet decision-making, with the exception of the election, which was her decision, and Brexit, where she keeps overruling her Brexit secretary. The other example you would normally use here would be Major, and to a certain extent, Brown. And over here, your other example would be Thatcher. And note how a presidential prime minister tends to be followed by a more collegiate prime minister. Anyway, just an interesting point of contrast there. This is also good use of evidence when we come to look at where decisions are being made. We can look at the Number 10 staff. Now, here we see the rise of the special advisor. That's your SPAD. Now, remember, these are not civil servants. They are there to give political advice to politicians, whereas civil servants are there to give statecraft advice to ministers. And clearly, these have been increasing over time. But really, I think if we look at the trends here, we can probably see that while SPADs generally have been increasing, the rate of increase has been much higher in the Number 10 office. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where decisions are being made, but it would support that assertion. So we might infer from that quite reasonably that the increase or the disproportionate increase of SPADs means that more and more decisions are being made within number 10 rather than within cabinet. And again, they were looking at the concentration of the executive function within the office of the Prime Minister. These are all bits of evidence that are explored in my other presentations. Again, that PM and CAB one. We're going to go on and talk a little bit there about May and Brexit in this particular presentation. I'm not going to go into that there because I'm running out of time on this one, and we need to push on. So all of that information is in the other presentation. Do come and see me if you've got any questions. We're just going to quickly rattle through the appearance and reality of prime ministerial power. The presidential wedge is something that we would tend to associate with Blair, and this is where he sought to differentiate himself from cabinet and indeed sometimes the party in the parliament. Press conferences were a novelty. Blair introduced those in the sort of presidential style. Also, he tended to announce everything himself, and my favourite one there is nuclear power, where he announced it was back on the agenda with a vengeance at a dinner with the CBI while his Secretary of State for Energy was being questioned by a Guardian columnist. Again, he claimed that people were wrong. Remember where his authority comes from. And yet he turns around and says that it was wrong. And in the end, he exited sharply, stage left. There he went. May, on the other hand, we have that very personalised election campaign, strong and stable. Well, that went well. And of course, as I said earlier, Brexit very much her baby. What I really want you to take away from this is that while we have the appearance of presidentialism here, in reality, what we have is someone who is vastly more powerful than the president. In the case of the Prime Minister, because of the relationship with Parliament, has a level of power of which a president can only dream. We know that when the Prime Minister says jump to Parliament, Parliament says how high. If the President says jump to Congress, he might get a grunt, he might get a what's in it for me. He's much more likely simply to be ignored. And that's even if his own party is in charge. Why does Parliament say it? Why does Parliament do as it does? Well, largely because of the institutional imbalance and the compliant majority. And again, those are explored in a different presentation, so I don't intend to go into them here in too much detail. The really, really important thing as well that you have to remember here is that because the Prime Minister has all of that power on the other hand, gosh, I could have explained that better, I'll start again. The Prime Minister might have all of that power, but all of that power is based on derived authority. And if it is all based on derived authority, then that authority can be withdrawn at any stage in the process. And so the Prime Minister can only ever be as strong as Cabinet lets them be, as the party lets them be, and indeed as Parliament lets them be. And what we've got coming up is a series of presentations or a series of examples that goes into those in much more detail. If any one of these layers in the cake or in the wobbly tower of power is compromised, then the whole lot comes crashing down, and there's really not very much the Prime Minister can do about it. So, what can we conclude up to this point? That we have the appearance of presidentialism, we can have presidential posing, and we can have presidential pretending. But in reality, we have a prime ministerial system, and that says that the Prime Minister has no individual constitutional authority, and they can be undone at any time by Cabinet, Party or Parliament. This is where we're going in the next presentation, or indeed by the people. And that again is the concept of elastic theory. We're going to explore even all of that in the next presentation, and I look forward to seeing you there. We're going to start by looking at what happens at an election and the difference between the UK and the US. But we'll come back to that then. I'll see you shortly. Bye.